All right. Hello, class. Welcome back to History 1301. Today we're doing chapter 12 for this recording for this lecture. Chapter 12 runs about 2 decades, 1820 to 1840. We're still in the Jacksonian era. Remember that Andrew Jackson doesn't leave office until 1837. So we're still in the age of Jackson. However, we're going to focus to a different kind of groups. Instead of just political parties, we're going to focus on, I guess, what we would call now nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations. So let's move on to like the more social cultural aspects of the age of Jackson. So this chapter is aptly titled "The Age of Reform," because the age of Jackson is also known as this age of reform. And reform, what does that mean? You guys heard this word before. We talked about the age of Reformation. Right, this is a couple hundred years back. This is in the 1700s, or starting with the 1500s. The age of Reformation was 1521, 1525, I believe. Martin Luther, in his 50 Theses against the Pope. So this is where I have the birth of Protestantism. Right, so it's a reforming, right? It's gonna reform. Right, think about the word reform. Let me start real quick. I think it's kind of important to, before we even begin to talk about the actual history of this, some basic vocabulary. Reform. So we have the root word form. We have some kind of form that's already made. Right? Something has a form. But what's going on now is we're gonna reform it. We're gonna change whatever it is. It could be anything. It could be religion. And in this case, though, for this chapter, it's gonna be the cultural body politic of the U.S. We're going to reform how U.S. society pretty much during these 20 years. All right. So from 1820 to 1840, a lot of changes are happening, basically. So, so I guess I kind of want to start with more general ideas of reformation, or the impulse of reform. Right. So there's I guess we call it about like two kind of fields or two sections, uh, reform of reform impulses in the United States during this time period, this 20-year span. So on the one side, you have like a religious kind of motivated vision of reformation, reforming society, saving society pretty much from the end of days. And this will be called millennialism. Now, we'll write that down. It's kind of important. Basically, the notion or the idea that the end of days, right, that the end of the world is near, and that the second coming of Jesus is nigh. So you have that kind of like vein of Reformation during this time period, and then the other kind of vein, the other side of Reform impulses during this time period is more social, or what some scholars like to call communitarian, and that's just one kind. Communi- oh man, I'm gonna erase the whole thing. Communitarian. Oh, God damn it. Communitarian. So this is really non-religious, but it's all about living in a community. So you have these two major kind of veins or inspirations or visions of how we should reform U.S. society during this time period. So let's talk about, I guess let's talk about some of these actual groups, right, that emerge, these organizations that emerge during this time period.
Daddy, and the juice fell on my blanket.
The juice fell in your blanket? Right, give me a quick second. My daughter dropped her juice in her blanket. ¿Qué pasó? All right, guys. Sorry about that. My daughter had a little accident. Dropped some juice on her blanket. She's worried, really worried about it now. And I really hope the background noise is just my air conditioner. I really hope you can hear me still. It's really hot now, huh? All right. So let's talk about the actual, I guess, groups um, that emerged during this time period, trying to save basically society. And save from what? Right? You might want to ask yourself, what are these groups saving society, U.S. society, from? So remember that the Industrial Revolution just happened, or it's happening, and it's changing the economy, the U.S. economy, and people are. But some groups, the religious groups at least, what they claim is that U.S. society is losing its, I guess it's faith, its piety in God. We're becoming more sinful, so we gotta save society from our sinful actions. So this burgeoning capitalism is kind of we're focusing more on making money than on saving ourselves and following the word of God. Some groups totally separate from U.S. society and they create their own little sect. You might want to call them cults. If you want to use that word. Their own little sectors of society, their own little organizations away from the mainstream as a protest and as an example of how to follow. Don't get me wrong, this is not unique to the U.S. This is something that was a transatlantic, this is transnational. There's a lot of these little communities and organizations also spread out in England and France. Right, so in France you have the Fourier communities, these utopian communities in France. That's all about this how to live harmoniously among each other. Utopia, that word utopia comes from this very famous um, book by Thomas More called Utopia. And basically, utopia is the idea of a place out there somewhere that's just perfect. Everything's in harmony. There's no strife. Uh, Competition is friendly and fair. Everything's pretty swell. Everything's just set. And this is what these groups are trying to create here in the United States. So one of the first groups that we're going to talk about, pretty interesting. Um, they're called. They're actually like a radical branch of the Quakers. So the Quakers are this nonviolent, anti-slavery religious group that came really early in Pennsylvania. You guys remember that? And this radical branch called themselves the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, or the Shakers. The Shakers, right? Like shaking something. And it's funny because they got that name, the Shakers, because the way they would pray was very eclectic. They would dance, they would sing, they would leap, clap, groan, scream, sigh. It was pretty crazy scene. Right? So they call them the Shakers because literally they were always shaking when they were praying. But this Shakerism, right? This movement, was transatlantic. Was not originally from the U.S. It comes from England, right? From 18th century England. Uh, this lady actually, this woman Anne Lee, who was a factory worker, um, and she believed she was the embodiment of the Messiah, the second coming. So she preached that we should return to a more simpler time, to simplicity and the purity of the early Christian church. So what these people followed, what they espoused, was just celibacy, purity. Right? You can't have sex. You have to be pure. You have to go back to the original, I guess, being, Christian being or whatever. Right? So purity and simplicity, the main thing. Right? This virgin purity was the pillar of their entire faith. Women and men lived separately. They did publicly pray together, but otherwise than that, it was separate. Um, and they actually were kind of influential during this time period. Um, all the way from Maine to Kentucky, you had all these Shakers organizations or local chapters sprouting out. Easily more than 5,000 members during this time period. It was established in 1787, and it lasted up to the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s. There are actually still some Shaker communities out there in Maine. It's kind of weird. So they rejected anything that was individual. So private property was not existent. And they were actually surprisingly very economically successful. To this day, like if you have like Shaker furniture, it's like really, really like expensive and like hard to find. People are like antique dealers are like very, very into that, the Shaker furniture. So they made pretty good money by selling to other people, but they kept it to themselves. And their whole point was to return to this purity, to this Christian purity, virgin purity. And you might ask yourself, so if they were celibate and they couldn't have sex, how did they increase their numbers? Right, so it wasn't by natural increase, but it was mostly by recruits. They were very successful in recruiting people, bringing new people in. So you have the Shakers. The next big, I guess, movement is obviously the Mormons. We talked about these before. This sect, this religious sect. The Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the official title of the Mormons. Right, founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith. And I already talked about the history. They were always exiled from wherever they went. They ended up in Salt Lake City, far west. And Joseph Smith was actually murdered for his beliefs in Indiana. But they had the same idea of trying to purify or reform U.S. society from its sinful ways, and that the second coming of Christ is imminent. It's about to come real quick, real soon. Thus, we need to purify ourselves. But what's more significant about these communities, right, especially the Shakers and the Mormons, right, these religious communities thus far, is that it kind of reflects, not kind of, it totally reflects, right, during this time period, the dissatisfaction with gender and economic norms of mass society. So these groups reflect that not everybody was satisfied with how capitalism and society was going with this industrial revolution. Right? There was protest against this industrial revolution. Let's talk about the next important group. And this will be like the communitarians. So not really about religion, but more about social justice and equality and economic justice. Right, so you have these utopian communities, these communitarians, such as like the Oneida and then the Owen Whites. and Brook Farm as well. So you had a bunch of these little, I guess, communes. That's all the communes. Everybody lives equally. There's no private property. Everything's shared. Um, hell, in Oneida, let me write that down. It's kind of important. This group here were pretty much the opposite of the Shakers. Whereas the Shakers were all about being celibate and this purity, this virgin purity. The Oneidans, this is Oneida, which was founded in 1848 in upstate New York. Um, they did have the same goal as achieving this moral perfection, right? Being morally perfect, but they got rid of not just private property, but all conceptions of individual, I guess, property, of individual ownership. So they even abandoned monogamy, a traditional marriage, right? It's just one man and one woman, right? And they kind of like own each other, more or less, right? Over here was like, no, everybody, all the members in this whole community, we're all a single family. We're all this holy family. That's what they called it. And everybody's equal. And what they practiced was not monogamy, but what Noyes, the leader, Noyes, called complex marriage. So what is this complex marriage? Let's see. Basically, everybody's free to copulate with anybody else if it's consensual. So there's no exclusive relationships, right? There's no exclusivity in sexual relations. If a man and a woman want to get it on, and the woman agrees, well, that's fine. Even if she was married, right, or had a boyfriend or whatever. That's the whole point of complex marriages. Um, right. The great danger, according to the leader Noyes, is that exclusive affections destroyed the harmony of the community. So instead of being exclusive to each other, everybody's equal and everybody's one big family. Needless to say, it didn't last long. This group, in 1848, this guy, the leader, Noyes, John Humphrey Noyes, he was arrested for adultery, and he fled to Canada, and just went to exile. So that was the end of the Oneida utopian community. What's interesting about this community, though, is that they would have procreation, right? They would have birth, but even that was regulated in a way. The way they set up a committee, basically, to determine which couples were allowed to have children or not. So this is an early form of eugenics, about an effort to improve the human race by regulating reproduction, by choosing the best. So yeah, we got some crazy communities out there. Right? We have some crazy ideas. Totally just going away, finding a whole alternative way of living from mass society. Um, Another important, I guess, community, utopian community, that was founded in 1841 in New England. And actually, this was a pretty interesting community. It was founded by the Transcendentalists. I believe we talked about this last lecture as well. And the Transcendentalists were people that were all about the fusion or the harmony between our spirit, our spiritual character, our spiritual nature, and actual nature in the world, Earth, Mother Earth. So they were against like this industrial revolution They would see machinery as alienating us, as scaling away from us, as taking away our human nature. And they were saying that we need to connect back to nature itself to get that back. And this is called Brook Farm, this community here that was established by these transcendentalists. And this was totally their hope, their goal was to demonstrate, to show to the rest of society how manual labor and intellectual labor could coexist harmoniously. How you could be not just right a philosopher or a poet, but you could also work with your hands as well, and these things could work harmoniously. And that was like their goal, their vision. They were also highly influenced by this guy named Charles Fourier. Charles Fourier, he was a French philosopher, social reformer, socialist, one of the big proponents of socialism. And he envisioned this community, this utopian community of communal living and working while still retaining some sense of private property among the members. So, there was trying to like kind of like mix, not totally get away from private property, but also find I guess like a balance between this utopian communal way of living where everything is shared, where you still retain some sense of private ownership. And that was Charles Fourier and Brook Farm, the embodiment here in the U.S. All right. Interesting thing about Brook Farm is that everything to the last very detailed was planned. How many members, how much they would charge for visitors to see the place to make money, and it was highly influential. This Brook Farm, a lot of like writers would end up going there to find I don't know, inspiration or whatever. One famous writer, a novelist, Nathaniel Hawthorne, ended up living there for a while, and he actually hated it. Right? He fucking hated it. He actually talks about how much he hated shoveling manure. That was like his worst job he could do there. So he would switch jobs there. Everybody would switch jobs. So it was like a really early attempt at this like communist, socialist community here in the U.S. Brook Farm. Nathaniel Hawthorne, he wrote a book in 1852, or a novel, The Blithedale Romance. And it's just a satire of Brook Farm, just making fun of it. So, you have your, not everybody was this is not for everybody, basically. But it was influential, right? I mean, it wasn't the majority of people that went to these places. It was really just a minority, right? It's just odd fellows, really, just weird people. But they did influence mass society, right? They did kind of force society to like stop and question themselves. It's like, is the way we're moving forward the way we want to be? So that's the reason why these little utopian communities, although small and kind of short-lived, are worth mentioning because it did influence what's going to happen later on in history here in the U.S. Another important community is the Owen Knights, right? And this is the communitarianism, this peaceful means of ensuring that workers will receive their full value of their labor. So what's going on in this industrial capitalism is that as a wage worker, you don't own what you make. Right? If you're a shoemaker in capitalism, that shoe you make is not yours or yours to sell. You're making it for somebody else, for the factory owner. So you don't own your full labor. Right? Somebody's making money out of your own labor. This is called surplus value. The surplus value of any commodity is exactly that, what It's extra. What's put extra to make a profit. The easiest way to increase surplus value is to minimize workers' paycheck or pay wage. Another way to, I guess, increase surplus value is to just, I guess, charge more, I guess, for the actual, to charge more of what it's cost, the actual cost. So I'll give you a quick example in the modern day. Right? What's the big difference between, I mean, really like a Michael Jordan shoe and some Converse? Maybe quality a little bit, but basically they do the same thing. Right? The use value is the same as a shoe. The surplus value is what we give it extra. Right? It's kind of irrational, actually. We pay more for the MJs than we do for some Converse. Why? Because of that surplus value. It's whatever the legacy of Michael Jordan and all that. That's surplus, right? And that's what makes profit to the capitalists. Right? So when I used to work for Starbucks for like about 5 fucking years. Every single cup of coffee that I made there was never mine. Right. So that's right. That's just like the actual value of making something, and then the surplus value is what Starbucks would charge the customer. Right. So it actually costs about maybe less than $1 to make a cup of coffee, and would charge $5 in Starbucks, right? And that's surplus value. This is what these guys were against, the Owen Knights. And this guy is a Robert Owen. He was actually a British factory owner. Right? He owned a factory in England, and thus he saw firsthand this exploitation of capitalism. And he totally, when he turned around, he was like, "No, I'm not going to do this no more, and I'm going to create a community that gets rid of this idea of surplus value. So we have to make sure that we're paying the workers the full value of their labor." This was the Owen Knights. This was in 1824. He actually purchased a whole community in Indiana, Harmony, Indiana, and then he called it New Harmony, and that's what his new community was. And we just call them the Owen Knights because of Robert Owen, the leader. Women were especially attracted to this community because he promoted equal rights for women, especially when it comes to education and the right to divorce. He was all about like give women education and give women the right to divorce. Just like any good communist would believe that the traditional marriage, where the husband is supposed to be, I guess, the main dude, right? The head of the household, I guess we call it. Think about coverture, the idea of coverture. He was totally against that because, like most communists believe, and communists as well, is that we believe that marriage is actually like slavery. The woman becomes a slave to the husband, especially during this time period. Now you can make an argument it's not like that no more. It's true, it's not like that no more, not at all. We have come a long ways with women's rights. We still have a long ways to go, but we've made a little bit of progress since 1820. But the Owen Knights and Robert Owen was that, right? Is that women were no longer being enslaved to their husbands. And these false notions, as we call them, about the innate differences between the sexes is false. That we should abandon this idea that the sexes are different and their capabilities and faculties. Biologically, undoubtedly, women and males are different, but under faculties or what they could do, right, socially and politically, that they're equal. And that was the Owen Knights idea. Fucking radical for this time period. Absolutely radical for the 1820s and 1840s. Totally controversial. So yeah, so we have these two veins, right? The religious and the discriminatarians, but they're all about perfecting the individual. How can we make not just the individual but society then in effect by perfecting the individual and then in effect perfecting society, we have a better world, right? This is the whole idea of perfectionism, that individuals and society at large are capable of indefinite improvement, that progress is always there. This was what tied these two seemingly different groups, the religious utopians and the communitarians, together. That they strongly believe that individuals and society at large could improve to the better indefinitely, forever. One of the biggest examples of this is the temperance movement. And what is temperance? Temperance just literally means moderation in the consumption of liquor. The temperance movement was pretty much a crusade to eliminate drinking entirely. This was highly, highly influential and popular in the North among the middle class. And during this time period, we have this emerging middle class because of the Industrial Revolution. So now we have, right, clerks, accountants, these professionals, right, these white-collar people. And they were the ones that were really attracted to this temperance movement. In 1826, we had one of the first, I guess, national temperance movement, the American Temperance Society. And their efforts were not just like for the hardcore drinker, like the drunkards, but even to like people that just would drink every other day or moderately. Right? They were all about totally getting rid of alcohol. A quick statistics are pretty interesting to find out here. By 1840, the consumption of alcohol had fallen tremendously since the 1830s, 1820s, even since like the beginning of the colonial era. For example, even in the Protestant ministers, when we first landed, right, the first kind of like generations here in the colonial period, Protestant ministers would actually ask and demand for wine and hard cider as part of their diet, right? So alcohol was a totally normal thing before the 1830s and 1820s. Totally normal thing. As a matter of fact, in 1830, the average of alcohol consumption in the nation was at 7 gallons per person per year. 7 gallons of alcohol per person per year. That was the average. Right? Insane of alcohol we used to drink back in the colonial period. This all changed from the 1830s onwards with this temperance movement. Another, I guess, organization that also promoted this temperance was the Washington Society, and they actually gathered like people that had reformed, right, ex-drinkers, right, recovered alcoholics, and they would have these experience meetings where they would tell about the experiences about being, enslaved to alcohol. So they would kind of like name it, and people become slaves to liquor and to the demon rum, and they would just tell their experiences when you were liberated and didn't drink no more. So and this was really, really big, absolutely, absolutely, very, very popular. And again, especially this is large emerging middle class um, workers. Of course, not everybody went along these reform movements. Many Americans actually saw these reforms as an attack to the democratic and to the individual freedom, as antithesis to democracy and freedom. So, for example, a group that the textbook mentions, Dr. Fauner mentions, is Catholics. Right? So most of these reform movements were run by Protestants with this idea of perfectionism, that we could become perfect. But most Catholics, right, have the opposite view of that. Right? They don't see nobody's perfect, pretty much. Right? It's actually like an affront to religion, according to most Catholics, to be as arrogant like that, that we could reach perfection, that we could become like godlike, pretty much. Right? So a lot of Catholics were like, basically, like, Catholics accept that sinning is part of our nature. Right? That's why a lot of Catholics go and confess regularly. That's part of their like religion, right? Catholics have to confess. Right? Sinning, the sin, is something that is just natural. Right? And to pretend or to promote that we could get rid of sinning indefinitely, right? This perfectionist idea. Most Catholics believe that that was just irreligious. It was just an affront to religion. So a lot of Catholics didn't abide by this, which would then kind of give more fuel to the notion of nativism, right? This discrimination against these migrants, these immigrants, especially the Irish people, right? Not all Irish were Catholics, but most Catholics were Irish. And then, right, they were poor, right? They would drink, and they would get other shitty jobs that everybody else didn't want. And a lot of reformers were actually nativists, actually against these newcomers coming from Ireland and spoiling society. Right? We don't need those unwanted people from, for example, let's see, where's this guy's name? Graham? John, what's his name? Sylvester Graham. So Sylvester Graham is, he was one of these reformists and a nativist. And he's best known now for the graham crackers. He's the one that invented the graham crackers. But this guy had, but he was all because he wanted to perfect society. So he was against, the Catholics because they drink too much, and then he was actually against husband and wives having too much sex. Because according to Graham, who invented the graham cracker, because he believed that wheat was better for our diet, so that's why he invented the graham cracker, to improve our diet, to make us more perfect in our diet as well, in our body as well, not just our spirit. But he believed that sexual excess between husband and wife caused ills ranging from headaches, chills, and impaired vision to loss of memory, epilepsy, insanity, and disorder of the liver and kidneys. So too much sexual excess will do bad for your body, physically. Right. So, yeah. So Sylvester Graham. Another person that also believe in this, not just reforming like our spirit and our minds and stuff, but our body as well, is Kellogg. I forgot his first name, but Kellogg, the one who made their cereal. Kellogg. He believed we should eat more cereal for a healthier diet, right, to improve our bodies. And these people are still around, right? Graham crackers and Kellogg are still very much around in our kitchens today. And they began here in the 1820s with this reform movement. All right. So let's move on to other kind of reform. I guess, before I talk about the invention of asylums and common schools, or public schools as we know them now, this is another wing of the reform movement. Let's talk about notions of liberty. Right, so most reformers believe that American society suffered from an excess of so-called natural liberty. So remember way back in one of the first lectures, in the colonial era, in Massachusetts, John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, the Puritan, right? He also made a distinction between natural liberty and then Christian liberty, right? Where natural liberty is the liberty that's the Indians have. That's just completely just natural. That has no civilization, no. It's just absolute liberty, and it's something bad, right? We need to civilize that. Whereas Christian liberty is like the more civilized, and we're free unto God. And so a lot of these nativist Protestant reformers believed in that America was too much stuck, or had way too much, had an excess of natural liberty. And thus we need to reform ourselves back to this Christian liberty of the morally upright citizen. All right. Well, let's move on to other kinds of public reforms. So one of the, I guess, important ones is the invention of asylums, right? Mental institutions, mental hospitals. So prior to the 1830s and 1840s, um, insane people that are not insane but mentally just had mental issues, would be locked up alongside with criminals, robbers, murderers, and whatnot. There was no distinction between criminality and insanity. It's just lump together, just lock them up and get them away from society. As a matter of fact, the I guess like the very notion or invention of a prison comes from this practice back in, oh man, 1200s, real 1300s, the so-called ship of fools. Right, so when people would act crazy in a town, whether in England or in Spain or whatever, they would kind of like tie them up, lock them up, and then the ship of fools would come around, and that's what they would lock them up there. It was like a prison, like a moving prison, and it was all for these crazy people, right? Called the ship of fools. Right? And that was kind of like the first ever asylum, which was not really an asylum, but it was not about reforming the individual and try to get them better and rehabilitate them back to society. It was the whole point before the 1830s and 1840s was just to get them away from society, just lock them up and get them out of our sight, so that they won't mess society up. Beginning in the 1830s and 1840s, especially with this one woman, Dorothea Dix. She she's a very interesting person. Um, she went around first. She went around. I think it was Massachusetts first, and she went around all the prisons, and she just wanted to investigate prisons. And then she found out like, oh my God, oh, women in prisons. And then she found out like a lot of these women are just mentally ill, not criminals, but yet they're here in the same place as criminals and treated just as badly as criminals. And so she saw that first in Massachusetts, and then she went to Virginia, and then she went to all over the eastern states. And she found the same common thread, right? That the criminals and the mentally ill were put into one place, a prison, and treated just as badly. So she really find this. I'm trying to find my page here with little Ted Dix. Penal reform. Yeah, there we go. I can't really find it. I lost my spot here. But basically, this one lady just wrote a lot of petitions and these essays, and just describing what she saw. She didn't really make exaggerate or anything. She just described exactly what she saw, and it totally turned popular opinion against state governments to do something better. Let me see what's going on here. Yeah, I kind of lost her here. And the main reformation that she did, Dorothea Dix, is that instead of thinking of prisons as a site of just punishment and isolating these bad subjects away from the rest of society, that we should actually reform these people. We should actually try to rehabilitate these people, educate them, and try to restore them back to society. Not just get them rid of them, but try to help them out. That was Dorothea Dix's contribution to this reform movement. So prior to this, there was only two kind of like I guess two ways of prisons, of setting up a prison. One of them is that prisoners would work side by side during the daytime, um, supervised, heavily supervised, but at nighttime they would be by themselves. This was known as the New York model, Sing Sing. You guys heard of this prison, Sing Sing, still around. That was the model, the Sing Sing model. You work all day together, right? Heavily supervised. You can't talk. You can see each other, look at each other, and it's about isolating each other so that these criminals don't influence each other. That was the whole point of prisons. But now with Dorothea Dix, is not that. Now we have to educate them. We have to restore them back to society. There's something wrong with them, right? Again, this notion of perfectibility, perfectionism, that individuals are capable of becoming perfect. Doesn't matter who you are. This is the reform impulse here as it comes to asylums and prisons. The next, another important institution that was, I guess, created during this time period was Common School, which is now we know as the state public school system. So prior to the 1820s, 1830s, there was no public schooling, really nowhere. Schooling was a private thing, an individual initiative. If you had the money, you could take your kids to a private tutor or to these private institutions of learning. But if you didn't have money, you worked to survive. Okay.
Dalia died.
Oh, okay. Until this one guy, namely one guy. I mean, of course, it wasn't only him, but he's really giving credit for really putting this on the legislatures of the states. Horace Mann. He was the first. He was from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was one of the first states to create a public school system. They created a state board of education, the first ever in the U.S. And Horace Mann was the director of that board, first ever director of any state of any board of education in any state in the U.S. And he strongly believed that public education via taxation, these public funds, would benefit everybody, not just the poor, but also the rich. How? By two ways, right? So Horace Mann was pretty smart, and he catered to both the working class and then this upper middle class and the rich elite, right? Because the rich elite were like, we're not gonna give money to pay for poorer kids' education. There was a lot of backlash there, especially in Cincinnati. All the rich dudes in Cincinnati were like, fuck that. We're not giving our money to educate poor kids. That's their fault. Horace Mann was like, no, guys, listen to me. So here's Horace Mann talking to the elites. Yo, we need to educate these poor guys, these poor kids, so they could become obedient, so they could be trained in your industries that you own, so they could become obedient workers. All right, and this public education is like a step towards industrial factories working. So we need to make sure that these poor students become, how can I say, obedient to rules. That they follow instructions. That they know their hierarchies and stuff. And then he will turn around and talk to the working class and say, yeah, look, the only way to make money in the U.S. now is by education. Education is what brings you prosperity. So that's why this is a good thing. So he kind of like, he was smart enough to talk and cater to both of these sides. And eventually he was successful. Right? And that's why we have public schools now, really, because of Horace Mann. So obedience to authority, right? Promptness and attendance, right? Being on time, right? Not ditching school and stuff like that, right? All this stuff, right? This curriculum that the schools are going to have, the silent curriculum, it's not explicit, but these are the rules that the students are going to have to follow, right? Think about your time in public schools or in school now, right? Obedience to authority, promptness and attendance, organizing one day according to some predetermined time period, right? We have first period, second period, third period, right? It was already predetermined for us, and we would just follow along. This is just a training us for industrial work in the factories. It still is that. Most public schools do that still. So that's Horace Mann and the common school movement. Right? They didn't call them public schools back then. It was just the common school. Right? But it's the same thing now. So these are kind of like some of the most important movements. But perhaps the two most important now, before we end the lecture here, is abolition. The abolition of slavery and women's rights, which also, in fact, even though they were the most important and the most impactful ones, they were also the most controversial, radical, and I guess resisted against. Right? These things, these ideas about abolishing slavery and giving women equal rights were not popular at all back then. Even within abolitionists, even within these reformers, these ideas were sometimes a bit too much. So let's talk about the crusade against slavery. Which is the abolition movement. Right? Abolition means just getting rid of. If you remember, right, for many, many years, for most of American history up to this point here, the only Americans that were willing to get rid of the institution of slavery, this peculiar institution, were the Quakers, slaves themselves, of course, and the free blacks. Besides that, everybody else was kind of okay and actually benefiting, right, or complicit with the institution of slavery, Southern or Northern. Right? We do have some early efforts of kind of getting rid of slavery, quote unquote. For example, the colonization movements, right? The American Colonization Society. Remember about Henry Clay, even President Jackson was part of this or a supporter of this colonization movement. Basically, that black Americans that were either getting their freedom. Once black Americans get their freedom, they should move back to Africa. That was the whole point of this colonization movement, the American Colonization Society. So they actually established a state over there in Africa, a country, Liberia, still around. Liberia is established by this American Colonization Society. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia. Monrovia, named after President James Monroe. So this was a really popular movement, right? Get them back to Africa. The only problem is that by 1830s, by 1840s, most black slaves in the U.S. were born in the U.S. Right? We had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, so we didn't have too many slaves from Africa anymore. Most were already naturally born here in the U.S. So that was a big problem for this. But these white people that supported this colonization movement didn't give a fuck about that. Fucking take them to Africa. Basically, they just didn't want black people around. Free blacks, they insisted, these people here, were a degraded group whose presence posed a danger to white society. They believed that slavery and racism was so embedded in American society that these two groups, free blacks and free whites, would never be able to live harmoniously. Thus, it would be better for both involved just for y'all to go back to Africa. So that's one of the first kind of movements to kind of abolish slavery, but not really, right? It's kind of fucked up. I must say though, some black people did move to Africa, um, really because it wasn't better to live in the north or in the south. Right? Wherever you went, there was discrimination against you, and very very limited economic opportunities. Whether you were in the north, or free black men in the north, or in the south. So, for example, this guy, I forgot his name, but he was one of these people that accepted to move back to Africa, even though he was born in the U.S. And he said that the legal slavery of the South and the social slavery of the North, right, never be a free man in this country because of that. Right. So there's legal slavery in the South, but there's also social slavery in the North. Right. It's not legal, right? It's not de jure, but de facto, black people in the North are still treated like slaves, anyways. So yeah, let's get the fuck out of here then too. And so some black people, some free blacks, did accept this notion of the colonization movement, of moving away from the U.S. and setting up a colony, Liberia, in Africa. And then we have the abolitionists. Right? These guys we're like, no, that's fucked up, guys. We just need to abolish slavery. That's the root of the problem. But not every abolitionist was the same. Right? We have the more militant wing, led by this guy, William Lloyd Garrison. And then you have like the more conservative wing of abolitionists there, push mostly for gradual abolition. Well, most people push for gradual abolition. Really, none of these abolitionists, except for the black abolitionists, we'll talk about a little bit later, push for immediacy, for the immediate abolition of slavery. Most of these abolitionists, especially the white ones, were like, no, we gotta do it gradually. So that's that. So you had the militant abolitionists, and these people were, we need to get rid of slavery as soon as possible, right? And by any means necessary, even by force. William Lloyd Garrison, he really never used force. He was not really like, when I say militant, don't think about like they're like violent. They're just more hardcore, more radical, right? So let's call them radical abolitionists instead. So this William Lloyd Garrison guy, um, he created a newspaper called The Liberator, one of the first abolitionist newspapers out there in 1831. It was a weekly journal, and in this journal, he said in the first issue, he said, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice on this subject, slavery. I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Right. So he's gonna call it out as it is. Right. Abolition. I mean, slavery is fucked up. We gotta get rid of it. You guys are immoral in the South. You guys are just racist, white supremacists. He was saying it as it is, and that was really really radical for this time period. As a matter of fact, um, he got attacked many times. And one time, a group of people, a mob in Boston, tied a rope around his neck and dragged him around the streets. Almost killed him. He actually was able to escape, but he was almost killed. As a matter of fact, a lot of Southerners, elite planters, would put bounties on these abolitionist leaders, right, to go kill them, and you get a prize, a reward. So not a popular movement, abolition, um, but it did influence people. It did basically what abolition did was it brought the debate about slavery up to the forefront of politics in the U.S. Remember how much we tried to avoid the debate of slavery. Remember about the Missouri Compromise and Henry Clay. All right, well, Maine is going to be accepted into the Union as a state, as a free state, but Missouri will be a slave state, and then we'll have the 56-30 line. And that's going to determine whether a free state in the north and the south states are going to be slaves states, right? And that was a compromise to avoid openly debating slavery. And then abolitionists came and it's like, no, we need to get this on front, up in the social radar. So we have, how did the abolitionists were able to spread this information and their message? So during this time period, we have the evolution of print technology. So we have the steam printing press now, where you could print millions, basically thousands of copies, right, within a couple of hours. Whereas before it was just, so we really just press it, right, to create copies. Now it's mechanical. You just bust out a lot of newspapers and pamphlets and essays. So that really helped out the abolitionist movement to spread their messages across. I mean, they were pumping 1 million of these journals a year to the South. As a matter of fact, it got so bad, this propaganda that the abolitionists were pumping around the U.S., that President Andrew Jackson initiated a gag rule, the so-called gag rule. God damn it. Basically, all these petitions and all these essays were not allowed to go into Congress. So congressmen were not allowed to read these things. It was, I guess, censored literature. In the South, the postmasters in the South, people that were in charge of the post office services, would intercept abolitionist letters and mail and just destroy it. Right? Totally illegal. But President Jackson okayed this because he was a slave owner. He was all about slavery, President Jackson. So you have that. You have Lloyd William Garrison. You have you have a preacher, very very important preacher, Charles G. Finney, who was an evangelical preacher. He would go around try to convert people to Protestantism, and he was really harsh against slavery, really really harsh against slavery. And he had like he was a really good orator. Right? Just think about these very famous preachers that talk about brimfire and stone and about hell is coming to you and stuff. He was one of those, and extremely popular. So that was another way that these abolitionists promoted their messages through religion. Right? A lot of Protestant ministers did believe that slavery was bad at this time period. Others did not, though. So there was two differences. Right? It's complexity in here. But basically, this preacher Finney and his followers, they identify slavery as a sin that needs to get rid of. One good thing, one crazy thing about the abolitionists, not crazy, but interesting thing about the abolitionists, is that they pioneered the modern fundraising campaigns for politicians. Right, so right now there's a big election coming up for 2020. And I'm sure you're getting bombarded by all these candidates to donate for their campaigns. Right? This was pioneered by these abolitionists, fundraisings, charity fairs, or these bazaars, as they would call them, where women would sell clothes or little trinkets for the cause, to fundraise, to make money. So this was an abolitionist. This is what these people did, right? With still in use today in politics. And also, right, when you buy these trinkets or this clothing from the abolitionists, they would tell you, they will have a message in them that you're buying for a good cause. Right? And now we have this. It's called consumer activism, where you buy for a trade, or you buy organic, or you buy, whatever, because you think you're making a difference. Right? You go to Sprouts instead of going to Walmart because it's organic and it's farmers that are getting the money and not these corporations. Right, so it's called consumer activism. So the abolitionists were also the ones who pioneered that idea that you're doing a good cause by buying stuff. Consumer activism. But their main weapon, I guess you could call it, not just for the abolitionists, but for all reform movements that we've been talking about so far, is the idea of moral suasion. And of course, it's going to give out here. moral suasion. Basically, it's just the best way to implement these reforms is to change public opinion, persuasion. Which is basically what it is. To morally persuade, right? To use the moral standing, the moral status of something that's being right or wrong, to persuade somebody into reforming. Moral suasion, right? The public sphere, the public opinion. So so most of these reform movements didn't focus on infiltrating these political parties or on or becoming politicians themselves, right? But more on the public opinion, which would then put pressure on the politicians. So go to the public and use public opinion to implement these changes, right? Moral suasion. All right. A lot of these abolitionists also use, don't get me wrong, the way they were not afraid to use like law, right, to promote their ideas. So, for example, a lot of these abolitionist movements would use or refer to the Declaration of Independence for their rhetoric and for their messages. Also, the Constitution. For example, abolitionists, they developed this alternative reading of the Constitution. Instead of focusing, the Constitution originally was to protect private rights, private property rights. That's basically the main function of the Constitution. These abolitionists gave it a different interpretation. It's not just about property rights, but about just rights in general, social rights. It's about that. That's the purpose of the Constitution, and that's how the Constitution is used now. Right? The Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, these people are in charge of suing states and governors and politicians, for example, like President Trump or whatever, for violating the civil rights that are implemented in the Constitution. Before this, the Constitution was not about civil rights or social rights. After the abolitionists, then we began to see the Constitution as a weapon to safeguard our civil rights. That's a big influence. It's a big change that's still with us today. All right. So let's talk about black abolitionists. So, well, the most militant, the most radical abolitionists were free black men, ex-slaves. No surprise there, right? Super logical. If you were enslaved, you experienced slavery. You're the best, position to criticize slavery and to know what's better for you. Right? Think about Frederick Douglass, perhaps the most famous black abolitionist in history, in the U.S. history, is Frederick Douglass. And we talked about this guy last time a little bit. But another important black abolitionist was this guy named James Forten. This guy was a sailmaker. He sails boats, Philadelphia. Very successful, actually. And he actually helped finance William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, that journal, that weekly journal that he had. So he was actually part of the board of editors for that Liberator with Lloyd William Garrison. Most of the subscribers for the Liberators were black freedmen, ex-slaves. Frederick Douglass, right? He was super important. He published an autobiography about his life, about time which became super influential piece of literature. You had Harriet Beecher Stowe. He wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm sure you heard of that. And this book is actually based upon the life of his slave, Josiah Henson. And if you never read Uncle Tom's Cabin, I strongly recommend you read it. It's pretty important to read. It's pretty graphic, right? It does show you what slavery is about. and it was extremely popular. This little novel. More than 1 million copies were sold by 1804. So pretty much within a year of its publication, it sold 1 million copies. It's a lot back then. It's a fuckload back then. Right? It's second to the Bible, basically, for this time period here, 1854. So you do have this very, and these people are like calling out slavery because they know it, and they want immediate abolition of slavery. It's gonna be like gradual slavery, or like some other abolitionists were about, oh, but let's abolish slavery, but we gotta pay back or compensate slave owners for their lost property. And these black people are like, no, fuck you. We're not property. We're humans. So the owners don't get nothing. They need to free us because we're humans. Right? So that's black abolitionists, which is more radical, more immediate, more urgent. It's logical. They saw it firsthand. I mean, there was strong opponents to this movement. Right? For us, it makes perfect sense to abolish slavery. But back then, even Northerners were very wary about this radical movement. During this time period, you have the rise of scientific racism. I think I talked about this last time as well. You have this book calls it pseudoscience. I don't like to use pseudoscience as a word. Pseudoscience kind of calls it like it's like a fake science, which now we know that phrenology, which is a study of the size of your skull, determines the amount of IQ you have, the amount of intelligence. The bigger skull you have, the more brain you have, and the more intelligent you have. And those white people had a bigger skull, and those were smarter than black people. And if you notice, if you study black people's skulls, in a monkey skull, like a gorilla skull, it's almost the same thing. So they're like animals. And if you study European skull, it's more defined. So we're humans. Right? This is now we call it pseudoscience, right? Because it's totally fake. But back then, this was scientific fucking truth. This is scientists back then. This was not pseudoscience back then. This was like Einstein back then, or whoever you trust. This was scientific data to them back then. So that's why I'm kind of wary myself of using the term pseudoscience when I refer to phrenology or eugenics or these other, I guess, scientific endeavors, because this was science back then. They didn't know it wasn't real. To them, this was scientific discoveries. Right? So racism, right, was not irrational. Right? It was backed up by these scientists that were claiming these things. Now we know it's fake science. That shit was bullshit. But back then, it was real as it gets. All right. So extremely, extremely powerful stuff here. Right? It's phrenology. And you have a really good illustration of this on page 442 of your textbook. When I'm talking about phrenology, about the scientific measuring of your skull and your cranium to determine if you're smart or not. Right? Right, so these pseudoscientific arguments for black inferiority were fucking popular back then. And again, it wasn't pseudoscience back then. It was actual science, scientific truth. Now we know it's not truth. But back then, it was science. Right? It was like the leading edge of science, scientific discovery. All right. Another important thing about black abolitionists is that, in comparison to the white counterparts, is that black abolitionists made it clear, right? They made it super clear that the poverty that African Americans, the free African Americans, the ex-slaves, are facing is due because of slavery. It's not because they're lazy or they're inferior, as these scientists are saying. No, it's because for hundreds of years now, we've been enslaved. So the poverty of the African Americans, these black abolitionists, rightly claim, and I believe this is right, is based because They were enslaved for so long. So freedom, right? This abolition was not just about human bondage. Right? It's not just about this social aspect or this religious aspect about being sinful or not or moral. With these black abolitionists, now abolishing slavery carried this economic dimension. It's really important. So who were the ones who were very hostile to this movement of abolition? Take a wild guess. Right? Planters, right? Southern planters, plantation owners, obviously. But what about the North? We had a violent opposition to this abolition movement in the North as well. Okay, which kind of goes against like the mainstream narrative that the North was all about anti-slavery. No, 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 not quite. Right? Especially Northerners that were the so-called gentlemen of property and standing, right? The elite Northerners, the merchants, basically the merchants that had close ties to the South, right? These elite merchants that were dependent on the cotton, right? The raw cotton that the South was producing for their factories up north. These people didn't want to abolish slavery because it would hurt their money, their profit as well. Right? So these gentlemen of property and standing, as they would call themselves, were the most violent uh, opposers, right? Opposition towards the abolition movement. To give you an example of how violent it got, in 1837, this anti-slavery editor, Elijah P. Lovejoy, he was killed by a mob in Illinois while defending his press. So what happened is that actually they burned his newspaper company 3 times before this, and he came back and republished and just created a new newspaper. The 4th time, they fucking killed him. They're like, okay, enough. 3 times, you're out, right? So for 3 times, they burned his newspaper company down, and 3 times he rebuilt it and started doing the same thing, talking crap about slavery, saying it how it is. And then the 4th time, this Elijah Lovejoy, they killed him. They burned him with the fucking newspaper company. And that's just one example of how violent it got. Right? Riots, race riots, were a common thing throughout this time period. So not everybody, right? Even so-called progressives from the northern states were on board for the abolition of slavery. This took a lot of struggle and work. It took a whole fucking war, basically, right, to get rid of slavery, the Civil War. But this is the beginnings of this, right? It's the movement of the ideas of, you know what, now we should talk about this up front. And this is a problem we need to confront. All right, so that's the abolition movement. And let's talk about another really, really important movement that unfortunately has not really come to full fruition, which is the women's rights movement. That's fucking sad, right? Think about that. We still haven't given women full equal rights. What the fuck is wrong with us? Anyways, I talked about Dorothea Dix already. We'll skip that. But, you know, women were excluded from politics, from social life, from the public sphere, from debating, from teaching, from everything, basically. Right? This really good historian, Howard Zinn, who passed away. I really recommend this one book here. It's called The Post History of the United States. Absolutely, really gorgeous little book here. And he goes against the grain. He tells you how it is. Right? He doesn't whitewash anything. He here claims that Columbus was a rapist and a murderer, which he was. Right? It's in here. And in this one chapter, chapter 6, it's called The Intimately Oppressed. He's talking about the woman in this time period. And I'll just read the first opening paragraph of this chapter. It is possible, reading standard histories, to forget half the population of this country. The explorers were men, the landholders and merchants men, The political leaders, men. The military figures, all men. The very invisibility of women, the overlooking of women, is a sign of their submerged status. And I guess just read the second sentence, the next sentence. In this invisibility, there was something like the black slaves, and thus, a slave woman faced a double oppression. So half this country's population were basically just invisible, right? Not in the public sphere at all. Stay in the home, make children, make kids, rear the children, and that's it. And feed your husband, make your husband happy. That was the whole purpose of a woman. Invisible, behind closed doors. Right? During this time period, we see the rise of the public woman. We see the rise of feminism, basically. So much of this movement of the rise of feminism is from the North, Northerners. Um, Many were Protestants, Congregationalists, or Quakers. Right? So very few became famous. Right? Very few we actually know their names and we actually talk about in history books. Right? Most of them are unknown, right? Invisible. But there are some names that I'm going to call out here that are really important to know. So we have one of the first ones is Lucy Coleman, and she's important because she's one of the first ones to become a teacher for blacks. Right? She was an abolitionist, and she was also for women's rights. So one thing you got to learn about here is that a lot of these movements, reform movements, were overlapped. A lot of abolitionists were also for women's rights. For example, Lloyd William Garrison was for women's rights. Frederick Douglass was all about women's rights as well, right? Their primary objective was the abolishment of slavery, but they also thought about women as well, right? So these reform movements often overlapped, right? So abolitionists and women's rights movements shared a lot of members together. Okay? This interaction, this interconnection, this whole network of different reform groups was known as the Benevolent Empire, right, as opposed to the Empire of the U.S. This is the benevolent, is the good empire, the one that's going to help people out. This whole network of reformers. So Lucy Coleman was the first teacher at a school for blacks, and a strong opponent of capital punishment. Totally against capital punishment. Harriet Beecher. Talked about her, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Catherine Beecher, her sister. Kind of part of she was more of the abolitionist movement. We have a primary source in this textbook of Catherine Beecher, and I want you to read it, because not all women were about equal rights. Catherine Beecher was like, no, women belong in the home. You radical women, just stay home. Oh, what happened here? Oh, okay. All right. Dorothea Dix. Right? Not only was she about reforming asylums and prisons, but also for women's rights as well. Very, very important for this. A really important group was called the Female Moral Reform Society. This Female Moral Reform Society first was targeting prostitutes and trying to purify prostitutes and save them from their wayward lives. And then they turned into the morality of just single women, not just prostitutes, but just single women. Right? So, and basically what they fought against was the double standard, the sexual double standard of men, where what they did, and I'll just read it from the textbook, it's kind of funny, it's kind of cool, I think it's kind of, should do this more often. They attacked the era's sexual double standard by publishing lists of men who frequented prostitutes or abused women. Right? So back then, it was okay for a man to go to a prostitute. But if you were found out that you were a prostitute yourself, that was the end of your social, I guess, character, right? For women. Right? So there was a sexual double standard, right? Men were free to do these things, But if a woman did that, right, forget about it, right? It was the ultimate sin. So this group, the Female Moral Reform Society, just called out on this double standard. Okay, so all these guys are like visiting prostitutes and have wives. We're going to publish their names in the newspapers to shame them. Right? And this became a pretty famous. I mean, they had a lot of local chapters throughout the U.S. Another important figures, women figures, is the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They first converted to Quakerism. They were from the South. They were from this really, really famous and powerful Southern plantation family that had a bunch of slaves, hundreds of slaves. They're fucking rich, and hundreds of slaves they owned. And one time they made a trip to the north. They went to Pennsylvania, and they converted to Quakerism, and they turned against their own family. They went around the whole U.S. and publishing essays about how bad slavery was, and they used their own experiences as slave owners to tell their stories and their movement. They were hated in the South, and they were loved by abolitionist circles. So Angelina and Sarah Grimke, and also they were both of them were very, very strong proponents of equal rights for women. As a matter of fact, there's a primary source of Angelina Grimke talking about that, about the important role women must have in this abolitionist movement. You also have Frances Wright. She was a follower of Robert Owen. She was a part of the Owen Knights. And she spoke throughout the whole country throughout the 1830s, the whole decade, about women's rights, slavery, and the plight of the northern wage worker. So she was like a pretty radical feminist, right? Frances Wright. As a matter of fact, one New York newspaper called her a female monster for shamefully obtruding herself upon the public, for shamefully just going out in the public and talking to public meetings. So this is known as the Lyceum movement. The Lyceum movement. This was very popular back then, where a lot of people would just go and talk and give public lectures. Lyceum movement. Right. So these public lectures were very, very popular back then, and most of the attendants were women for these lectures. So this Lyceum movement, you see this emergence of the woman into the public sphere. Frances Wright was one of those speakers, lecturers for this Lyceum movement. Another important woman is Maria Stuart. She was a black Bostonian. She was black from Boston. And she became the first American woman to lecture to a mixed male and female audience. And she was black too. So pretty important, Maria Stuart. So let's talk about the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Very, very, very important group convention. So Seneca Falls, New York. That's in upstate New York. Falls Convention, 1848. So you have people such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So these are the more famous feminists from this time period. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You have Lucretia Mott. She's actually an older woman. She's a veteran of this. Maybe you've heard about her before. And these two people were the key organizers of this Seneca Falls Convention. So what is the Seneca Falls Convention? Why is it so important? So on July 14, 1848, 5 women, including Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, they placed this advertisement on the Seneca County Courier, this newspaper in the Seneca County, and it's stating that, quote unquote, a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women will be held in the Wesleyan Chapel, Seneca Falls, New York, on Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and 20th of July, current commencing at 10 a.m. So they just put this ad out there. It's not really thinking nothing of it. Lo and fucking behold, the response was over fucking whelming. About 300 people or more showed up, including men. Over 40 men showed up to this. Kind of unheard of for this kind of convention. And one of these men was Frederick Douglass, who showed up, who traveled from Philadelphia to Seneca Falls to go and participate in this convention. So the group debated, voted on for these 2 days, and they passed the so-called Declaration of Sentiments. This is modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And they actually adopted the same like axiom, the Jeffersonian axiom, all men are created equal. But they modified it to say all humans are created equal. Right? They added a woman. Right? All men and women are created equal. Right? And then remember the Declaration of Independence was just a list of grievances against George III. Where he does this, he does that, he taxes us without, he does all this bad stuff to us. The same kind of setup, but against men that they do against women, right? So the same model, right? They just kind of like, they modeled the Declaration of Independence to write this Declaration of Sentiments. And they also readapted the legacy of the revolution, right? Freedom and liberty, to their own feminist vision. So they gave us a whole list of resolutions of what we could do, society at large, to make things better for women. And some of the amendments were specific, social and legal changes for women, such as including women in the role of lawmaking and legislature, improved property rights, equality in divorce, and access to education in the professions. All of these resolutions that they passed, more resolutions than this, but these were the main ones. All of them passed unanimously except for one resolution. Guess which one did not pass unanimously? Giving the woman the right to vote. Apparently that was way too radical for some of these people here. So, and that's pretty much the end of this. Right? Feminism, right? And again, this is an international movement. It's not just unique to the U.S. Give me a quick second here. All right, sorry about that. My daughter's being frustrated. Can't be, because I'm not paying attention to her. All right, so let's talk about a couple more women, and then we'll call it a day here. So, feminism was an international movement. Um, a lot of feminists were also emerging in Paris, for example, in London, and these people had connections, right? They had communications with each other. Feminists from the U.S., with London and Paris. It was this whole international movement, not just national. Let me see. I guess I'll just end this with this woman, Sojourner Truth. Black woman, an ex-slave. And like Frederick Douglass and his black abolitionists, she made it perfectly clear that the plight of poor and working class women um, were the same. This oppression is shared by not just slaves, but by women as well. Um, and she has this very famous essay that she wrote called "And Aren't I a Woman?" Aren't I a woman? Saying that we women are also just as capable of hard labor. Look at me. Sojourner Truth was a slave. And when she said that, she was like, she flexed her muscles. She was like, aren't I a woman too? So women could also work, right? Not just the home. Um, so just kind of to end this page now, to end this, this chapter now, we start seeing not just a preoccupation with women and slaves, but also with the economy, right? Now we're seeing the definition of slavery not just applying to blacks, but also to the idea of wage slavery to northern workers. And this was used by the Southerners to defend slavery. And now it's kind of being used for everybody. They want to get rid of this oppression for everybody. All right. The social freedom is what we need to emphasize here. Right? Freedom for everybody. Everybody's worthy for freedom. Okay? Um, Nonetheless, the abolitionist movement, just like most leftist progressivist movements, split up. There was a major schism in in this um, in this movement, and the major schism was because the role of women, the woman question. What is the role of women in this abolitionist movement? Some people, um, what's his name? Forgot his name, but he was the opponent of William Lloyd Garrison. So William Lloyd Garrison and his groups, the radicals, were all about women. They're like, yes, women needs to be involved in the decision makings of these large conventions of abolitionists. And the split happened in this one convention. Um, the American um, Anti-Slavery Society had a national convention, and they voted Abby Kelly, this woman, as part of the board of directors for that society. And this created a backlash by some members there that didn't want women part of this to have decision making. There were women were just auxiliaries. They shouldn't have decision making roles. So they split off from this American Anti-Slavery Society, and they formed their own abolitionist organization, the American and Foreign Anti-Slave Society, which would later become the Liberty Party, its own political party. Um, and yeah, basically this abolitionist movement kind of not teared away, but it created two different wings, right? One that was pro-woman and one that was not pro-woman, right? So this woman question was still very, very not easy pill to swallow. As a matter of fact, women would not get the right to vote until 1920, right? So we're still with that today. We're still dealing with this issue today. But basically, long story short, the abolitionists' greatest achievement, perhaps, lays in the shattering of this silencing of the debate of slavery. That before abolitionists, we believed that the best way to preserve unity of the nation was to avoid explicitly debating slavery. And abolitionist movements shattered that silence. They were like, no, we need to talk about that. All right, that's pretty much the end of this chapter. Um, Next chapter, we're going to talk about westward movements, moving towards the west, and the increasing division between slave states and free states, and the question of slavery. That's going to become ultimately important in the next two chapters. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much.